Now, the NL Central is an interesting division. Last year at the 60-game mark, every team was within 5 games. Now, it'll be interesting to see how they do in a 60-game season this year. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it should be a very competitive division this year. Once again, the Reds got much better. You could even argue that I guess the Pirates took a step back. I think the Cardinals should be around the same. Cubs should be
Hmm.
very good again, and you know it's gonna be a tough division once again.
It's going to be a tough division. And this is going to be our second installment in the MLB preview series. And just like we did in the last one, we're going to be going over every team, their rosters. We're going to give our picks for their MVP, their X Factors, their Cy Young. And afterwards, we're going to give our projections for the standings.
Yep.
So let's start off with the Chicago Cubs. Last year at the 60-game mark, they went 34-26. This season, they actually got a new manager, David Ross, replacing Joe Madden. And they didn't have a great offseason, if we're being honest. They got rid of Nick Castellanos, Carlos Gomez, Cole Hamels, Jonathan Lucroy, Addison Russell, and Ben Zobrist, just to name a few.
Hmm.
But they did add Jason Kipnis, Jeremy Jeffress, and Steven Souza as the biggest names.
Yeah, they had the bad part about the Cubs offseason was they couldn't do much with the money they have tied down to a lot of these players.
Hmm.
So I guess they maximized with the money they had, what they got. Kipnis is a very solid veteran that should fill a hole that Addison Russell left, and Souza is a good bench piece to have. Jeremy Jeffrey should help the bullpen. So as a Cubs fan, I guess there's nothing to brag about with what they
Hmm.
got, but can't also complain at the same time.
It wasn't a great offseason by any stretch of the imagination, but it could have been worse. Is exactly what you're trying to say.
Yeah, I think Cubs fans are also very happy about David Ross being hired. World Series hero
Hmm.
for them. You know, Joe Madden had his time, won the World Series, will always be remembered as a legend as a Cubs manager, but it's time to move on.
It is time to move on. And it's time for us to talk about this lineup. Now, we talked in our NL East division video about how a couple teams, especially the Mets, were going to benefit a lot from the DH. I think the Cubs are another team that benefit from the DH. I mean, they have a great lineup already. You have Javier Baez, Chris Bryant, Anthony Rizzo. You have a pretty decent outfield with Jason Hayward, Kyle Schwarber, Steven Souza. And you have a top 5 catcher in the league, Wilson Contreras. Now, where I think this helps him a lot is with Victor Caratini, their backup catcher.
Mm-hmm.
He's another solid bat, can hit pretty well for power, and he's nearly as good as Wilson Contreras, but he obviously doesn't get enough playing time and is overshadowed by Contreras, and he'll fit well in at the DH spot.
Yeah, I think the DH spot should be very interesting for the Cubs. I think, in my opinion, the main option for them is going to be Kyle Schwarber, who is, in reality, he's been in DH, just stuck in the National League for his whole career. And I mean,
I
that
didn't
will
even think
allow,
about.
yeah, that will allow the Cubs to play Albert Moore Jr. every day in center field. You could play
Mhm.
Hayward in right, and then Souza will just shift over the left. So, I mean, they got a lot of options. Should be interesting to see what they do with that.
Yeah, whether it is Schwarber that moves to the DH, because he also is a catcher until Contreras had come up and burst onto the scene.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
It would be between him and Caratini that would be, I would think, probably splitting time at the DH spot when neither of them are playing in the field.
Yep, definitely agree with that.
Now, this rotation it's always been pretty solid. Nothing like extremely crazy, but still solid, ranking above average in the league. And I think this year is going to be no different with the trio of Yu Darvish, Kyle Hendricks, and John Lester. I don't really think that the front of the rotation has any worries.
Yeah, I think the front three should be fairly strong. It's just the back end is where the question marks start to pop up. I think Jose Quintana had high expectations coming over to the Cubs and hasn't been crazy impressive since he's been there. I think he is a candidate to bounce back for sure. And
Sure.
then Tyler Chatwood, he's a 5-starter. Whatever team you really put him on, he's a number 5 starter. So I think if the top three do their job, the 4 and 5, Quintana and Chatwood should find a way to get it done.
Hmm. Now, let's talk about someone that always gets it done, Chris Bryant. He's
Mm-hmm.
my MVP pick for this team. And, I mean, I don't think there's really much of a doubt. He won the MVP in 2016. And since then, he hasn't really looked back that much. I mean, he wasn't fully healthy in 2018 when he only played 102 games. But when he was healthy last year, he had 31 home runs and 77 RBIs. He hit 282 and had an OPS over 900.
Yeah, I mean, you can't really go wrong with Chris Bryant, but I also decided to go with a different Cub for my MVP, and I decided to go with Javi Baez. That is
Okay, the
just
most overrated player in the MLB.
I wouldn't call him overrated. I think he's really starting to turn into I wouldn't say maybe a superstar, but definitely one of the best shortstops in the game.
No,
He hit
he's definitely had an impressive past couple of years.
Yeah, he's been All-Star 2018, 2019. He hit 281 last year, 290 the year prior. He could hit for power. He could run. He's a good average guy. So I think Javi Baez is going to be the heart and soul of this team next year. And I think can't not to knock Rizzo or Bryant, but Javi's I think the most feared hitter in that lineup, in my opinion.
And he's also, I mean, not just a great hitter, he's also a fantastic fielder.
Mm-hmm.
I was honestly surprised he wasn't even a runner-up for Gold Glove. He had 26 defensive runs saved last year, which is phenomenal.
Yeah, I think he got knocked in the Gold Glove, like I guess running for. He plays so many different positions, and it's hard to give him a Gold Glove at one position because he plays second, short, and even a little bit of third so well. So, he's just
his versatility does help him, but he, especially last year, started to solidify himself as a shortstop. So he'll probably stay there for the majority of his time. But
yeah, that's
we'll
where I
see how it
expect to
goes.
see him. Yeah.
So now we'll move into the X Factor, and this is really an interesting one because Craig Kimbrell, I have been berated for saying this for some time, but if I had been saying for a couple of years now that if he can replicate what he did in Atlanta and San Diego and even Boston for the second half of his career, he could possibly be as good as Mariano Rivera once was. Now, people are going to have a bad taste in their mouth because of last year. We had a 6.5 ERA. He blew a bunch of saves. And striking out 30 batters wasn't bad in the 21 innings that he had. But he also gave up 9 home runs.
Yeah,
in 20 innings.
I also had Craig Kimbrell as my X Factor. I don't know if I have him as the same, if I value him as much as you do, the whole Mariano Rivera.
It might be a stretch, but it's a hot take, and that's what those are meant for.
No, yeah, I love a good hot take. But he definitely, if he can get back to that form, he will really, really help the Cubs because they haven't had that guy in the bullpen they can really rely on a few years. So that'll be huge.
No, they haven't. Ever since Chapman left, they have been struggling to find really solid guy at the back end. I mean, Wade Davis was not too bad for them in 2017, but it wasn't really as good as he was in Kansas City. He was kind of a disappointment in terms of what they thought he was going to be.
Yeah, Kimbrell, I mean, I expect him to bounce back. He did sign that contract late and join the team late. So
I think that's a big reason why, because he didn't have the time to prepare.
Yeah, so with him having the whole season to prep, he should be a good bounce back candidate and should help that team win.
Now, the strength of that pitching staff, like we had talked about earlier, is the front end of that rotation. There are 3 guys that you could really name as the Cy Young, and I personally had picked Kyle Hendricks because Kyle Hendricks is a guy that is relatively young still at the age of 30, and he's yet to have a bad year. In 2015, he had his career worst 3.95 ERA, but his FIP that year was only 3.36, and his WHIP was 1.16, which is also pretty impressive.
Yeah, Kyle Hendricks has been super, super consistent the past 3 years. He's always been a reliable guy for the Cubs. You expect him to take the ball every 5 days, and definitely a great pick to be a Cy Young possibly this year on the Cubs. But for my pick, I decided to go with Yu Darvish, the big contract they just gave to him recently. I think.
Can't hate on you for that one. I respect that pick.
I think I don't think Cubs fans are crazy about him just because that contract he got, and he hasn't really lived up to it yet. But he had a decent year last year. He took the ball almost every 5 days, had a sub-4 ERA. So I expect him in the 60-game season to want to prove something and try to be the horse of that rotation and really carry the Cubs.
He had that 6 or 7 game stretch. It was when the Mets played them. I think it was in May or June.
I think it was June.
Yeah, in June he had a 185 batting average against.
Yeah, he's been that guy in the past that he's been an ace. It's just I think ever since that Game 7 when he was on the Dodgers just left a bad taste in his mouth and he hasn't been able to bounce back. So I think this year should be the year that he should be able to figure it out and get back to his old self.
Definitely. Definitely should be. So let's move on to the Cincinnati Reds, perhaps the most improved team in the uh, AL Central, and they
Totally agree with that. Yep.
had a fantastic offseason. They got four big names. They got Nick Castellanos,
Hmm.
which they stole from the Cubs, Derek Dietrich, Mike Moustakas, and Wade Miley.
Yeah, they had. You could argue they had the best offseason. Adding Castellanos and Moustakas just turns that lineup completely
Mm-hmm.
around. They
And that
had.
lineup was already had a few big pieces in it. If you
Yep,
were
for
talking about,
sure.
say, Joey Votto or even Aquino, who had that fantastic second half of the year.
And I think the guy that's always forgotten about is Eugenio Suarez, who is
Definitely.
actually I have him as my MVP of the team. People forget he was top 3 in home runs in the NL this past
Yeah,
season.
he was. He was second. He had 49.
Yeah, he was right up with Alonso and Yelich, Bellinger, all the sluggers. So he had a really good year that flew under the radar. And I think that if he has another year like this, and he's not going to be under the radar anymore, he's going to break out and be one of the stars in the game if he can put up those numbers.
Mm-hmm. My pick for MVP was Mike Moustakas. Everywhere he's gone, he's been able to perform, put up numbers. He had 87 RBIs last year, 95 the year before, 85 the year before that. And he's had 28 home runs or more in each of those 3 seasons. He's also hit above 250 those years, which is always something you like to see. Had an OPS above 770 all those years. And he's really been consistent. And wherever he's gone, he's stepped up and been the guy that the team needs him to be. And I expect him to do the same in Cincinnati.
Yeah, Moustakas is a great get for them. I mean, with this new universal DH, he could possibly slide into that role, possibly
If he
play
needed
second
to.
base like he's been doing with the Brewers the past few years or so. I mean, it's interesting. There's a lot of options they could do with him. And,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's a great get, really huge addition.
Now, as for the X Factor, I'd like to hear your pick before I go into mine.
So my X factor is this guy's been, he's a pot stirrer, I would say. He loves to, I don't know, he's been in the middle of a few fights. I'm a fan.
Oh, I
I
think
really
we
like
might be
this
having the
guy.
same guy.
Yeah, so I went with Amir Garrett as my X factor.
Oh,
So
no, never mind. I've got a different guy that likes to stir the pot.
yeah, so Amir Garrett, he's kind of blew up last year for getting that whole brawl with the Pirates, and he had a little dust up with the Cubs. But aside from all that, he's been at times he's been a pretty elite reliever. So I think if that guy has a chance to just maybe put that whole fighting behind him and just focus on getting guys out, he has a chance to be a dominant lefty and be a really strong piece of that bullpen.
Mm-hmm. And that's a big thing that he does need to worry about because as much as people don't like to think about it, baseball at the end of the day is a mind game.
Yep.
And if you're worrying a lot more about, who you're going to get into your next fight with, you're just focusing on that instead of perfecting your craft. And at the end of the day, it's just going to hurt your level of play.
Yeah, for sure.
Now, who I picked is another guy that likes to stir the pot, and he's extremely divisive, especially over on Twitter. But that's Trevor Bauer. And
Yep.
Trevor Bauer, I'm personally a big fan of Trevor Bauer. I think he actually makes a lot of good points in a lot of his things. I listened to his podcast a couple times, the Watch Momentum podcast, Bauer Bites podcast, actually, with the Watch Momentum Network. And he's a guy that he's really self-conscious, honestly. So he thinks he's better than he is, but he can back it up because in 2018 he was an all-star with a 2.21 ERA.
Yeah.
Last year when he was in Cleveland, he was a 3.79. But he's a guy who prefers to be the number one or the number two guy. When he was in Cleveland, he knew that Kluber was an all-star, Cy Young candidate every year. So he was able to live with being the number two starter there. But now if you look in Cincinnati, he's probably going to be the number three starter behind Sonny Gray and behind Luis Castillo, maybe even the four if you think about Wade Miley. And I think that that's something that Bauer, especially the confident and how do I put this? The confident and arrogant in a way kind of guy that he is,
outspoken,
outspoken definitely. He needs to figure out a way to realize that he's not going to be the number one guy here because when he moved to Cincinnati, he had a 6.39 ERA. He was not good by any stretch of the imagination last year in Cincinnati. But I think a big part of the reason is he's not adjusting well to being a back end of the rotation guy. He wants to establish himself as that first or second guy, and he can't exactly handle being the third or fourth guy in a rotation. So he needs to learn to respect that and learn to accept it. And if he can do that, I think he could return to 2018 or first half of 2019 Trevor Bauer that he was.
Yeah, I think with a little bit of consistency with the team, he was always. I think the trade rumors bothered him last year on the Indians. There's been trade rumors
Mm-hmm.
up since the start of last year, and once he finally got traded, I think he was just adjusting to Cincinnati the second half last year, which maybe led to some of those poor numbers. But knowing that he'll be in Cincinnati for this whole season, I think he should have a strong year. I expect him to bounce back and be like 2018 Trevor Bauer.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I completely agree. And I think we also agree on the Cy Young as Luis Castillo.
Yep, so underrated. Such an underrated
This man
pitcher, I
is a
think.
strikeout machine. He got
Mhm.
226 strikeouts in 190 innings last year.
Yep, he's got the best
Now,
changeup in baseball by a lot.
no doubt there. And his biggest issue is giving up the long ball.
Hmm.
He gives up about 27 home runs a year so far in his 3-year career.
Yep.
But as long as he can tone that down, work a bit more on his fastball and like his slider, and get those strikeouts even up a little bit more possibly, and get the home
Mhm.
runs down. The home runs down is the biggest part. I think he could be a top 10, top 15 pitcher in baseball.
Yeah, changeup's a interesting pitch to have as your go-to because if you float it, it's gonna get hammered for a home run. So
Mm-hmm.
I guess that could be a reason for the high home run totals. But if he really develops those other pitches that he's not getting hurt by his changeup when he misses, then he's gonna be. I mean, he'll turn into one of the best pitchers in the game. I think I think the sky's the limit for this kid.
No doubt there. And I think these Cincinnati Reds have gotten a lot of pieces, and they're a very complete team. One of the more complete teams in this division. I'm not going to give away anything about their records just yet. We're going to wait till the end of the podcast for that.
Mhm.
But they definitely have the potential to have what it takes to not be good just this year, but for years to come.
Yeah, exciting team they got in Cincy for first time in a while.
Mm-hmm. Now let's move on to the Milwaukee Brewers, who were tied with the Cubs for the division lead at the 60-game mark last year at 34-26. They lost Gio Gonzalez last year, lost Yasmani Grandal, top 2 catcher in baseball,
Yes.
Mike
Yep.
Moustakas, Jimmy Nelson, Eric Thames. They've lost quite a few guys.
Different looking team for sure.
It's going to be a very different looking team, but core pieces do still remain there. You've still got Brandon Woodruff. You've still got Josh Hader. You've still got, obviously, Ryan Braun and Christian Yelich
Lorenzo
out
Kane.
there.
Yep.
Lorenzo Kane, can't forget about him. I think that it goes without saying that Christian Yelich is going to be their MVP.
I completely agree with that. Yeah, I mean Yelich, 2018 MVP overall, the whole league. I think he's the face of that franchise now. They hit the ball out of the park with trading for him. He has been, I guess, I wouldn't say surprisingly better than what he's been, but he's definitely out. He's definitely outperformed expectations when they got him.
Mm-hmm.
The past 2 seasons has turned into one of the best players in the game, and I expect him to have another big year in these 60 games and put up some nice numbers.
Exactly, because when he was with the Marlins, you're like, yeah, he's a good player, but you never expected him to be a top 5 MVP candidate. I mean, he won it 2 years ago, and honestly, I thought he should have
Finished
won it
second
last
last
year.
year.
I think he
Yeah,
should have won it
it was
last
a
year.
toss up between those two. They both had insane years.
Because I tend to be on the side where I prefer actual value to a team for at least for MLB MVP in terms of who is the best player. Because Bellinger did have a better year, but that's partially because Yelich was hurt. And if you look at it, the Dodgers probably were going to be the 1 seed anyways, even without Bellinger. But without Yelich, the Brewers weren't a playoff team. I mean, he was injured for 40 games or so last year, and they barely made the playoffs. If he
Exactly.
wasn't
Yeah.
there for 60 or 80.
Yeah. He's a heart and soul of that team, and if he's healthy and he bounces back from this injury, he's gonna have a big year for sure.
100%. So now let's move on to the X Factor. Who do you have your pick for the X Factor?
So I'm going with a guy who he was actually hurt basically all of last season, but when this guy's healthy, he's electric. So I went with Corey Knebel, who should slide in and be the closer for the Brewers.
Yeah. So for me personally, I picked Ben Gamel because he's shown that he's had the potential to be a pretty solid hitter. In Seattle, he hit just over 270 for his career over there. He hit around 271, 272 there. and he got on base really well. He got on base about 34% of the time, and when he went to Milwaukee, those numbers went down a little bit. His batting average went down to 248, and his on base percentage went down. Actually, his on base percentage went up, from his time in Seattle. His on base percentage was 335 in Seattle, 337 in Milwaukee. But he also didn't produce in terms of getting runs nearly as much. He had only 7 home runs and 33 RBIs in 134 games. Yet when he was in Seattle and played 134 games in 2017, he had 11 and 59, close to double on those numbers, which are decent numbers. I think any team would be happy for that for a guy that is going to be playing 134 games in a 162 game season, which would probably translate to about 45 games in this season. But that's why I have him, because he's hit or miss.
Yeah, Ben Gamble should see his playing time go up a little bit more with the departure of all those big names you mentioned. So I think that's a great X factor. Definitely a name to look out for.
Now, who do you have as your Cy Young?
So my Cy Young, I didn't go with the starting pitcher. I decided to go with Josh Hader, who has been one of the most dominant relievers in baseball recently. He had a little bit of a down year second half of last year, but I think once people stop catching up to his fastball, he'll be right back up where he was, and he should dominate once again.
Now, for me, before I talk about my reliever, my Cy Young, I just want to discuss Josh Hader for a minute, because I would not put him as mine, because, like you said, he had a down second half of the year, especially in July and August, where he had a 3.97 in July, 5.79 ERA in August, and he also blew 5 saves in those two months. He was 7 of 12 in those 2 months, and it's hard to judge a player just off of 2 months, especially when he's been lights out for his entire career aside from that. But then you also look at how he did in the postseason. I believe it was his first postseason appearance.
Only, they lost in that wild card game.
They lost in that wild card game, and he blew it. He didn't have any of his stuff. He was wild. He walked a few batters, and obviously the play in right field that went through his legs blew it for him. But it really shows me that I don't know if he's able to take the next step and be a great playoff pitcher. And clearly in the second half of the year, people are starting to catch up to his fastball. And I'm not certain that people are going to just suddenly stop catching up to it. When you finally figure a pitcher out, I feel it's something that kind of sticks.
Yeah, I mean, Josh Hader has been one of the most used relievers in the past, I guess, 2.5 years. So that could be one of the reasons why I think people have been catching up to his fastball. So he threw, which is insane for a reliever, he threw 75 innings in 2018 or 2019, and in 2018 he threw 81. So when you look at those numbers, that's a crazy amount of innings for a reliever, especially in high leverage situations. So I think with this time off, he had a chance to rest his arm. He should be fresh and ready to go for these 60 games. So that's why I think he's going to turn back and be the lights out reliever he was.
Yeah, you make good points. And if he's the Hader that he was from April to June of last year, and if he can turn his fastball back up and mix it up just a little bit, because he relies on that so much more, because he also throws a slider and a changeup, but he relies on that fastball so much more than any other pitch. If he can start to add those other pitches to his repertoire more and work on them more, he'll be a nasty reliever.
For sure.
But I just wanted to touch on that, because there is a bit of a chance that he could not be the best reliever in baseball like he was last year for the first half. My Cy Young, was Brandon Woodruff. Pretty good pitcher. He had a 3.62 last year, but he had pretty bad fielders around him. He had a 3.01 FIP, which is field independent pitching. It attempts to take the pitcher's true outcomes into consideration and get rid of any fielding factors.
Yep.
And I think that if he could continue to have a great year as that number one guy in the rotation, it'll be really good for the Milwaukee Brewers.
Yeah, he's an underrated pitcher, I think. He kind of flies under the radar because he used to be in the bullpen for the Brewers. But I think he should have a strong season, 60 games, take the ball every 5 days, and should be a good option for them.
Yeah, last year was the first year he really started to be a starter, and we'll see how he does in his age 27 season.
Yep.
But let's move on to the Pittsburgh Pirates, who they, let's be real, they had a absolutely awful offseason, probably one of the worst off seasons in the entire major leagues. And they were 29-31 at the 60-game mark last year. So if you're going off that, you'd think they would have a chance to do well in this season. But then you look at the way they did in the second half of last year, and they ended up the season 69-93. And now that they are losing Francisco Cervelli, Melky Cabrera, Francisco Liriano, especially Starling Marte, those other names might not mean as much to you, but Starling Marte is a huge loss. And they're going to be replacing with like Gerard Dyson. For a team that was already struggling on the offensive end, it's just unacceptable to replace Starling Marte with Gerard Dyson.
Yeah, the Pirates have been a sad franchise to watch the past few years. They had so much promise with, McCutchen, Polanco, Marte, Garrett Cole, all those guys. And then it just seemed like that one bad move they did by trading Tyler Glasnow, Austin Meadows to the Rays for Chris Archer, who has done nothing but stink since he's been in Pittsburgh. It's just been that one move that has almost set the franchise back maybe 3 years. Who knows? They just have not been the same team since.
At the very least, because now we're a couple years out of that trade, and they're far from being able to get back to that level. I mean, especially the biggest part I think that's hurting them is not even just the lineup, because the lineup's not great in its own end, but they at least have a couple bright spots in Josh Bell, JT Riddle, even Adam Frazier possibly. The worst part to me is just their starting rotation. I mean, we were doing research and discussing, and it's just hard to find someone that you could even consider putting as a Cy Young candidate for them.
There's not even a guy that really stands out. I mean, I guess Chris Archer, he's had his moments, but he's down with the injury. So
yeah.
So without Joe Musgrove's an interesting name to look at. So I mean, it's just no one too exciting right now in the Pirates, I would say.
Yeah. Speaking of Joe Musgrove, I did put him as my Cy Young candidate for them, but that's not really saying much because it's the Pirates and they don't really have many other options. I mean, he's always had an ERA above 4, and if that's the guy they're putting out as his ace, that's going to be an issue for them.
Yeah, I had Musgrove actually as my X factor because I mean, for me, it's you don't know what you're going to get out of that kid. He was pretty highly touted when he was in the Astros organization,
100%,
and he got traded over for Garrett Cole. So I mean, that's a big name to get traded for, and he hasn't really. I wouldn't say impressed anyone. He hasn't been unimpressive. He just really just been a number 4 starter. That's all he's been, and he hasn't, made any improvements since. So I mean, we'll see what he does. He's an interesting name to look at, though, for sure.
If he's your X factor, who do you have as your Cy Young candidate?
So for my Cy Young candidate, I got Trevor Williams, who was, I'd say 2 years ago, 2018 season, he was an electric pitcher in the second half of that season. So if he could bounce back and, have a really good year, he's, I think, the best pitcher in that rotation for sure.
Yeah, that's a good call. So you had already talked about your X factor, so I'll talk about mine, which is the young man Brian Reynolds, who actually finished 4th in the Rookie of the Year voting last year.
Yeah.
He only played 134 games, but he had a pretty solid season. He hit 16 home runs, 68 RBIs, and he hit .314 with a .503 slugging percentage, .377 on base percentage, and he's looking really solid so far, especially with little protection in his lineup. So that's why I have him as he could be my MVP pick, but I'm going to have him as an X factor just because we've only seen 1 year out of him, and I would like to see a little bit more out of him.
Yeah, I like Brian Reynolds. He reminds me a lot about Jeff McNeil we got over on the Mets. So
pretty scrappy player.
He sprays the ball over the place. He hits for average. He has a little bit of pop. So definitely a name to look at in the next few years going forward.
100%. And then let's talk about the MVP. This is a guy that we both haven't touched upon yet, but for me, it's going to be Josh Bell, and I believe for you, it's going to be the same.
Yeah, I also have Josh Bell. Yep.
I mean, Josh Bell, he was an all-star last year, and he had 116 RBIs. He had almost 40 home runs at 37, and he hit for a decent average, too, at 277. He got on base at a 367 clip. He's a really good all-around guy, and he's not a great fielder, but you don't really need that at the first base position.
Yeah, Josh Bell was very, very highly touted coming up through the minor leagues of the Pirates. And his first few years in the bigs, it wasn't anything impressive. And then this past
Although
season, he really broke out and really, really came into his own and turns into one of the best first basemen in the game.
Well, in 2017, his rookie eligible year, he did actually have 90 RBIs, so he has shown what he could do then.
Yep.
Then in 2018, he did have a down year,
He
but
did have a down year.
last year he showed that he can consistently put up what he did in 2017, and that wasn't a fluke.
I think last year is the player you'll see from Josh Bell going forward. 2018 was just a little bit of growing pain, and he should be a consistent player.
Mm-hmm. Especially with so few pieces around him, it's hard to do it every single year.
Exactly, he's got no protection in that lineup.
Mm-hmm. Now we'll go to the St. Louis Cardinals, a team that was 31-29 last year, and then really disappointed in the playoffs last year. But their team's looking pretty solid once again this year.
Yeah, this team I think should be very hungry coming into the season. They got absolutely embarrassed in Game 5 of that NLDS, and that
game I turned off in like the second inning.
Oh my God, unwatchable. It was like 11-0 after 2 innings. So
yeah,
I'm sure those guys. I mean, the Cardinals are a very proud organization, and they take a lot of pride in being competitive every year and winning. So they don't. That's not something that they'll forget about, and they're going to want to come out firing in the beginning of the season.
And they're going to use that as having a chip on their shoulder. I mean, they're a team that can easily win this division this year. It's going to be a hard division, but they can win it, especially with that rotation that they've got. I mean, they brought back Adam Wainwright, who is going to probably be their fifth arm in that bullpen.
Yeah.
I mean, they have Miles Michaelis up there. They have Carlos Martinez, Dakota Hudson, and obviously Jack Flaherty.
Yeah, they got some interesting arms in that team. I would probably slate in Carlos Martinez. I think he's kind of accepted his role as the closer of that team, depending what Jordan Hicks does coming off Tommy John. But, I mean, 1 through 5, it's an interesting rotation. You got Jack Flaherty at the top, who had a really, really good year last year. Michaelis had a little bit of a down year, but he should bounce back. Wainwright, 100%. Very solid. Dakota Hudson, young arm that kind of established himself as a number 2 or 3 in that rotation. So I expect – and Reyes is actually coming back too from Tommy John. So they have a lot of arms that should be exciting to watch, and they should have a really strong rotation.
Their pitching should not be an issue to worry about. And now what's interesting is I'm looking at who their catchers are, and back in 2012, these guys would be highly touted. You got the duo of Yadier Molina and Matt Wieters as their catchers.
Oh, yeah, this would be one of the two catchers in the league if this was 2012. But, I mean, Yadi's going to be Yadi. He'll be out there for – I'll be shocked if he plays all 60. I mean, Yadi's Mr. Consistent, definitely Hall of Famer, and he's going to definitely be behind the plate. I expect to see him a lot.
Mm-hmm. So maybe Matt Wieters would move over to that DH quite a bit.
Yep, definitely.
But then you've got a solid lineup the rest of the way around. You got Matt Carpenter, Paul DeYoung, Tommy Edman, Paul Goldschmidt, Harrison Bader, Dexter Fowler. Just a bunch of guys that could slip in anywhere you need them to in the lineup and rake.
Yeah, they might miss Jose Martinez, who they traded to Tampa.
And Ozuna a little bit.
I mean, they got solid bats that they should be able to, scratch and claw towards the top like the Cardinals always are.
And one of the most solid bats is Paul Goldschmidt, my MVP pick. Mm-hmm. And he's one of the most consistent first basemen in the league. I mean, he's always putting up at least 30 home runs, nearly 100 RBIs. I mean, last year he had 34 RBIs and 97 RBIs. It was perceived to be a down year for him.
Yeah.
And it was more perceived to be a down year because he had a 260 batting average. But even then, that's still pretty fantastic. And I think that he's going to carry this lineup further.
Yeah, I also had Paul Goldschmidt as MVP. I mean, like you said, the average is down slightly. I expect him, second year in St. Louis this year coming up, he'll be comfortable now, and he's going to do normal Paul Goldschmidt things and just rake.
How about for the X Factor? I'd like to hear yours first.
For me, this is a guy who's been, I want to say under the radar, but he's very highly touted by people in baseball. So I went with Harrison Bader, who should be top of the order for the Cardinals, center fielder. And I picked him as my X Factor because he has been a little up and down throughout his season. And he can hit for average. He's got some pop, and he's a very, very good glove center. But he hasn't put all three together at the same time. So if he could be consistent with all three at once, he'll be a very, very important piece of that team.
Yeah, that's definitely a pretty good pick for your X factor, especially because he's still young at the age of 26. He just turned 26 last month. But my pick was Matt Carpenter because he's starting to get older. He's 34 now, but he, especially in his earlier day, even when he was 29, 30, and like 32, he's shown that he could hit home runs totals near or above 30 and drive in 80 runs. He has had OPS is above 800 for 4 straight years between 2015 and 2018. And last year he had a bit of a down year, but he only played 130 games. And once he get back to the 2018, 2017 self, he'll be a fantastic bet in the middle of this lineup. The only thing is, again, he's 34 and he's had some consistency issues over the past couple of years.
Yep, Carpenter's another name that will extremely benefit from the universal DH, and that will give him a chance to get his legs a little fresh when he needs them, just to take a day off and play DH. So yeah, I expect him to be, hopefully Matt Carpenter of old and have a bounce back here.
So let's move on to our MVP. I think we both had the same one once again. It's the young arm, Jack Flaherty.
Yeah, you can't go wrong with Jack Flaherty for Cy Young. He was up in the Cy Young conversation in the whole league last year. So I mean, I expect ranked fourth, exactly. So he's a young, exciting pitcher, and I expect him to be, challenging the DeGroms and Scherzers of the world for Cy Young in the NL.
He actually led the NL in hits per 9 innings last year with only 6.2, which is remarkable for
really impressive.
Who was 23 at the time.
Mm-hmm.
But those are the teams.
Yep.
So let's get into our predictions for the standings.
Yes, let's do it.
I'd love to hear yours first.
All right, so for my NL Central predictions, I have the Cardinals coming in at first with a 39-21 record. Right behind them, I have the Chicago Cubs with 36-24 record. And the Cubs, I also have them making the playoffs as the second wildcard team, but
interesting.
That's for a future pod, I guess. For
yeah,
Cincinnati.
We'll do a podcast after these discussing the playoffs and MLB awards.
Yeah, for sure. So Cincy, I got coming in at third place with the 34-26 record. I do have them missing the playoffs, but that is a huge, jump from where they have been, being above 500 and being in contention
100%.
all the way. And then Milwaukee, I have a 33-27 in fourth place, and then in fifth place, I got the Pirates pretty far behind the top 4 teams at 21-39.
Yeah, this is going to be one of the closer league divisions in the MLB.
Yeah.
Talked about in the last pod about how the NL East is going to be pretty close as well. But for me, I've got the top 4 teams are all within 7 games.
As do I.
I've actually got the Cincinnati Reds in first place here at 37-23. I think they'll definitely benefit from a shorter season because they're one of the teams that could get hot and get hot quick, especially with teams in the AL East that they're playing, like Kansas City and Detroit. They'll be playing them a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Then I've got Milwaukee just 1 game behind them at 36-24. And then I have St. Louis in third place at 31-29. I just think that they had a not great offseason. They lost Marcell Ozuna and Jose Martinez. And those were 2 pretty big pieces in their lineup last year, and I think it'll definitely hurt them. But then I have the Cubs in fourth place at 500 at 30-30. And then the Pittsburgh Pirates are quite a ways down at 18-42, 19 games out of first place.
Yeah, I like that. I think 1 through 4, you could argue any position of those 4 teams. They're all, I want to say they're all so similar. I mean, the Reds are interesting to look at first for years because I can't say I love their bullpen. I mean, they got
that's a
Amir
big
Garrett
issue with them.
and Michael Lorenzen, but outside of
they're
that,
both.
they got to
Amir
find
Garrett's
identity.
still a wild card, as we discussed earlier.
Mm-hmm. So I mean, those teams though, they all have their flaws. The Brewers don't have the strongest rotation in the world. The Cardinals lineup is, we'll see what that does, and the Cubs bullpen. Who knows what that's going to look like. So it's really who comes out firing in that division, and that should come on top.
Yeah, it's a big question. Who can get a pretty big hot streak? Who can capitalize on another team's mistakes, and who can try and patch the biggest holes, whether it's with maybe a trade, if there are going to be trades this year, maybe a mid-season call-up, if you want to call it a call-up,
Yep.
whatever it is, if they can find a way to patch their holes, whichever team does that the best, or whichever team capitalizes on the other team's holes the best, will be the one on top.
And like you mentioned, the team that beats up on Kansas City and Detroit the most will, no doubt, probably be on top of this division.
Now, the team that actually I think gets the biggest advantage there is going to be the Cincinnati Reds, because they do play Detroit 6 times, and Detroit's going to be probably the worst team in that division. So I think they benefit the most, because if you look at the Cubs, they only play them 3 times. The Cardinals also only play them 3 times.
Yeah, with the whole new MLB scheduling, the way they did it is, they're trying to limit travel as much as they can. So, these teams are like, for the NL East, for example, the Mets are only playing I think the Orioles 3
Orioles 4
times.
times.
Well, the
4.
Nationals play them 6. So it's like, the numbers are not all the same. Teams, get a little bit of an advantage. So it's just, the scheduling, it shook out that way, but teams, they're still going to have to play all 60, and you never know what could happen.
And it's a big advantage depending on if you got a good roll with the schedule or a bad roll.
Yep, exactly.
Especially in such a short season where every game counts.
Yep.
That seems to be the theme of all these podcasts. Every game counts.
Every game counts, in this new COVID-19 reality we're dealing with, all these changes, everything comes a little bit more important.
Yeah. Well, I believe that just about wraps it up for our podcast today, the NL Central one. Be on the lookout for the other ones. We got NL West, AL East, AL Central, and AL West left to go.
Yep.
Thank you for joining me, Mr. Heenan. I'm sure you'll be here for the other NL one.
Yep. Thanks for having me. It's always a good time talking baseball. Can't beat it.
It's a pleasure as always. And thank you, everybody, for listening. Subscribe, download, all that fun stuff. Have a good one.